Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on a Saturday to come and listen to all of us talk about a variety of elements of our Irishness and the Irishness of people who live in Ireland, but also the Irishness of people who live all around the rest of the world. And the idea for this panel, which is called Choosing Irish, came out of discussions that we've had here over the last few years, where we have had people from the diaspora, we've had people who came to Ireland as immigrants, we've had young Irish people who've gone abroad and come back, talking about various different elements of their Irish identity and their relationship to Ireland. This day last year, I had people on this stage who had come to Ireland from Poland, from Syria, from Nigeria, and we had an amazing conversation about different types of Irish identity for people who have chosen this as their new home. And I was struck when I came home to Kerry this week, there was a piece on the news, which we're just going to play as a video now in a minute, about the new citizenship ceremonies that took place in Killarney earlier in the week, about people choosing to take out Irish citizenship after making their home here. So we're just going to play that video quickly before we introduce you to our guests.
Journeys which began in every corner of the globe ended this afternoon in Killarney, County Kerry, with the granting of Irish citizenship.
Hi, how are you? Brilliant.
Nora Kobusenje came to Dublin from Uganda a decade ago to study accountancy. Today she works with the central bank.
It's great. It's just great to be here. It's just great that I'm becoming an Irish citizen.
Vanessa de Arujo came to Ireland from Minas in Brazil in 2007. Now she lives in Newport in County Mayo, and she too is one of Ireland's newest citizens.
My mum lived here for a couple of years, and in the beginning I was meant to come here with her for a while, but I fell in love and I stayed.
Candidates for Irish citizenship.
Felicia Matola is a Franciscan missionary sister for Africa from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
I have come to love the Irish people through our own sisters who are so wonderful, but also the people I've met here in Ireland.
So I extend a very warm welcome to you.
Finance Minister Paschal Donoghue attended today's ceremony. His wife, British-born Justine Davy, was among those conferred with Irish citizenship.
This is your first real test of solidarity. And
Presiding Judge Brian McMahon said today's ceremonies underline the human rights to which all citizens are constitutionally entitled.
There are no half citizens or old citizens or new citizens or second-class citizens. Everyone is equal after the citizenship ceremony.
By the end of the year, just under 120,000 people will have been conferred with citizenship at 135 ceremonies around the country. Paschal Sheehy, RTE News, Killarney, County Kerry. Journeys which began in every corner of the globe ended.
Now, what struck me about that, other than the fact that Paschal is from Tralee, where I'm from, and it took place in Killarney, was these are amazing stories of people who've chosen to come and make their life here. And it's something that our grandparents probably would have found very strange when millions of Irish people have left Ireland for so many centuries, that Ireland is now a place that people choose to come and make their home and to become citizens. And we have 5 people here to talk to us today who also make choices about their Irish identity, because there's something very interesting about not only people who come here, but people who leave, in the sense that when you go abroad, as I did and as many people in this room have, there's no obligation on you to continue identifying as Irish or to continue behaving as Irish or to stay in touch with your Irish identity. But many people do, and many people do through many generations, even if they've never been to this country. And what we'd like to discuss with our 5 guests today is what kind of choices are involved in that type of identity, and what are the different types of Irishness that people of all different types of backgrounds have. So if you'd like to welcome our 5 guests, we've got Patrick McCormick. Julian Coman. Got Gavin Kelly again. Deirdre Connelly. And Killian Quigley. Now, I'm going to start off with you, Patrick, talking about the different types of Irish identity that the 6 of us on this stage have, actually, because there are a lot of different nationalities represented here, despite the fact that we all have something in common of a link back to Ireland. I wonder if I could just start by asking you, what is your connection to Ireland originally?
Well, thank you, and thanks, Chris, for having me, and thank you to Murren Kelleher and to Philip King and to Nuala O'Connor. It's an honor to be a part of this conference. I think that one of the things that we were talking about even beforehand was you go in with a little bit of trepidation as a Irish American whose relatives came during the famine migration, talking about your deep connection to the country. But I think that for me, one of the things that crystallized it was going to Notre Dame as an undergraduate. It's a university that played a major role in the way in which I think Irish Americans integrated. It played a major role in even repurposing things like ethnic slurs into mascots, and I think that it also informed a kind of view of migration in particular as an issue of ethics as well as of economics and the kind of more traditional, the ways in which or frames that we have for the issue. And one of the things that I was reflecting on before coming is that it's quite interesting. There was a story in the midst of, you may have seen in the midst of the coverage of the so-called caravan of migrants that were coming from Central American countries into attempting to enter the United States. There was a picture actually on the front page of the Washington Post of a young migrant, Javier Flores Maldonado, who was wearing on his shirt a picture of, a monogram of the University of Notre Dame. And I think that it was such a striking image because I think that as an Irish American, you feel a deep sense of responsibility around those issues. And it's why I'm grateful to be here and to be a part of the conference.
It's very interesting that you say about, I mean, your family came to or went to America during the famine. That's 150 years ago, but so obviously the sense of Irish identity is still very strong for you, especially through, as you say, your connection to Notre Dame. Do you find, I mean, you mentioned there some trepidation that you had coming on the panel today. Do you find, as an Irish American from one of the most iconic Irish American institutions with the, the Fighting Irish, the way that Irish American identity has been, codified over the years, do you feel awkward coming to Ireland talking about being Irish American? Do you feel that your Irishness, in quotation marks, feels twee or different to Irish people? Or do you find that Irish people still identify with Notre Dame and with Irish America in the way that allows you to not feel awkward about it?
Well, I think that I've been fortunate in that through relationships I've had with folks here that there hasn't, it's felt extraordinarily welcoming. And I think that I do think though that there definitely is an intuition that you don't want to be presumptuous about the identity. You don't want to presume to. In particular, obviously, because of how some aspects of the identity, I think, have been simplified and commercialized and reduced. And so I think that one of the really interesting things to explore is in the shared history, are there opportunities, given what we're seeing now globally on a whole host of different issues, are there opportunities for us to creatively explore how that identity might surface in ways that could be, I think, quite constructive on issues where there aren't issues like migration, where there aren't necessarily where it's clear that the political kind of the political incentives run in the opposite direction. I mean,
it's really interesting. You mentioned that image to me from the Washington Post the other day, and I looked it up, and it is a really striking image as an Irish person to see that. And I guess what it really brought home to me, and what your experience by going to Notre Dame and continuing a link with Ireland that stretches back over a century and a half, is how much of being a member of the Irish diaspora involves different choices, and there are different stories that you can put yourself in or tell. There's a story of Irish America, which is a story of, fighting against prejudice, pulling ourselves up from our bootstraps, sticking together, finally making it in the land of opportunity, etc., etc. There's also a story of Irish America that is the story of people fleeing, a country in famine and poverty and so on, and then seeing images of that on, the equivalents of those people today as symbols of something that is shared in a more global human sense. And I guess how we create stories of our Irishness is something that is always changing. I mean, do you feel that the story in Irish America, like you've moved on from Notre Dame now, do you feel that the story of Irish America is changing? Do you think that it's different now to how it was in the past?
It's an interesting question. I think that one of the fault lines that we've seen is whether or not it's going to be a closed identity, or whether it's going to be one that, in the context of American citizenship, whether it's going to be one that's open. And I think that we've seen this with the current administration, where a number of Irish Americans have taken a view that is perhaps one quite different from a view of how that history might be leveraged for advancing shared values and entering into the meaning of that identity. And I think some of the ways that you're talking about.
That's very interesting. I mean, I'll come to you next, Deirdre. Deirdre, you're also Irish American, but in quite a different way to Patrick, in the sense that a lot of your life has involved constantly coming back to Ireland, and you have many relatives still here in Kerry, many of whom are in this room. She's got
lots.
We've got a lot of home crowd here today. There's a lot of Kerry connections.
Thanks for coming.
A lot of Kerry connections going on. How, as an Irish American who has a slightly different relationship to Ireland, to the sort of Notre Dame, family came during the famine, maybe go to Ireland on holiday eventually when you grow up, rather than your experience of coming back. Could you explain to us what your connection to Ireland is, and how it makes you feel as both an American and as someone who is in some way Irish as well?
Sure. My mom is from Castle Gregory, and my dad's father is from Galway, and his mom is from Sligo, and they emigrated to Boston and met there, and he was raised in Boston. My mom emigrated with her sister in 1960 to Boston, where she met my dad. And we really always had a connection coming back here most summers. My grandmother was here. My mom had two brothers that stayed behind, and they have kids who are my close cousins. And for us, it really just was always part of the fabric of our lives, and I would consider it more of a home away from home. You know, there's people I have very deep friendships with and have my whole life, and we were talking earlier in the week, and I think for me, it's a little bit more, I grew up outside of Boston. Going home to Hingham, Massachusetts is even less home feeling than coming to Castle Gregory, because in Castle Gregory, people stay, and you have connections that last your whole lifetime, and you can pop down to drop in on somebody you've known your whole life, where I think in a suburban U.S. place, it's more like a little more transient, and I don't have those connections in the same way. Plus, you can't just walk outside to the pub. You have to drive somewhere, so it's a little different. So my connection's been very deep. And my parents also opened an Irish art gallery about 30 years ago. So in Massachusetts, it also was a big part of our lives to stay connected to the Irish community, and they hosted classes for language and history, and we always went to Irish festivals, and so it was just a really, I guess I chose it, but I think it chose me as well. Yeah,
there's a certain amount of it that you can't escape, right?
Exactly.
I suppose that's definitely true. Growing up in Boston, obviously, Irish
Yes.
America, the capital of Irish America in many ways. What was Boston like as somebody who was not the child of people who had come to Boston 100 years ago and were part of the Boston Irish community, but who was the daughter of people who had grown up in Ireland and who come? Did you feel different to other Irish Americans you knew whose lineage was further back, or is Boston so Irish that it just pulls you in that way?
I think, I did feel different. I think because it's huge. It's a huge factor in Boston life to the Irish community. I live in New York now, and it's a very different thing. I mean, I'm connected to the Irish community there, but I would have to seek it out a lot more than in Boston. Boston, it's just everywhere. But I do think that many of my friends I grew up with would identify as Irish Americans, but had never been here. Their sense of Ireland was very different than what I would experience. Just it's like a place that they probably will actually never go to, but it's in their mind. It's this just magical place that lives in their imagination, But for me, it was really a very real thing, and I had really identified with the culture in a way that I don't think that all Irish Americans do. I think it's just varying degrees.
That's interesting that you say about the magical place and the magical idea, because when we were talking on the phone earlier in the week, we were talking about the experience of when you first land back in Kerry, when you've been away for a while, and what it feels like. And I think, as you know, Kerry people, we're all walking advertisements for how great Kerry is all the time, and we like to talk about it. But we were both saying about how there is a feeling that it is slightly magical for you when you come home, that there is a feeling of, whether it's exhaling or being relaxed or falling back into relationships with your relatives or going into the pub and people singing or talking or whatever. Like, there is an element of it that the myth in some ways is a reality still for you. And like, how does that feel when you, because you live a very different life in America as executive producer of a very high profile late night TV show. When you come back to Castle Gregory and go into the pub, like, those must be very different worlds. How do you feel about those two parts of your identity that are obviously both really important parts of your life?
Yeah. Well, I will pander to the crowd and say that Kerry is magical, actually. So
we're all very on brand here today.
Yeah. I think actually my cousin Sean and I have talked about this before, that weirdly New York and Castle Gregory are not so dissimilar, because, and I know that's a stretch, bear with me, I'll get there.
And people say Kerry people exaggerate.
But everything's kind of accessible. You can walk to the shop, you can walk to the pub, your sort of life is around you, and New York is the same way. So I think, you know, sometimes not to go back to Massachusetts, but it can feel it's a little more isolated in the way that you live your life and can drop in and see people and have a lot of activity around you, you know. So I do, and you know, we've brought many friends to Castle Gregory over the years, some who have Irish connections, some who have none, and it always lives up to their expectations of Ireland. Just, you can breathe easy, and it's beautiful, and the mountains and ocean, and people are really friendly. So I think the notion of Ireland actually becomes very real coming here and going to Castle Gregory. So, yeah.
That's really interesting that you say about Castle Gregory and New York being similar in the sense of a mental landscape of like somewhere that you can walk and be part of a community and so on. And that's something that was obviously, you know, Philip was talking earlier about, you know, people bringing Irish music to America in the period that Patrick's ancestors went to America. And one thing that has always struck me as amazing is how little Irish communities recreated the communities that they had at home when they went en masse. So there were parts of New York that reflected a little village in Kerry or a part of Roscommon or wherever, where they spoke a particular type of Irish and played a particular type of music and so on. And while that obviously faded away in the great churn that is America, there's something interesting about how people how people's communities extended across oceans and continued, and that the weird connections of Irishness. I mean, my grandparents are both from Kerry. They met in London, you know, in the Galtymore, where, you know, God knows how many Irish marriages began. And that to me is really interesting of how people carry that sense of home with them, and that you were able to kind of carry it from both sides. Julian, you have a very different experience of Irishness maybe to the Irish-American story, where Irishness is sort of present all the time, because we have as Brexit has sort of brought to the fore in terms of the issue of passports and citizenship and so on, there are millions of people in Britain who have an Irish parent or an Irish grandparent, but outward Irish identity in the sense of Notre Dame, Boston, St. Patrick's Day and so on is much less visible amongst those people in that community, even though they are often much more recent immigrants, and even though Britain is obviously much closer than America. Could you tell the audience a little bit about your connection to Ireland and where that began?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad Patrick, by the way, felt some trepidation, because so did I. And this, in a way, it's part of the story that this is the first time that I've ever taught. That makes it sound like a revelation is coming. It is coming out. But yeah,
it's coming out as Irish, exactly. Yeah.
Whether you like it or not. But anyway, it became clear why that kind of halting start happened, I think, when I explained, really it's my story is, in a way, the story of a kind of recovery of Irishness, perhaps, certainly an interest and fascination with my Irish past, which I never had direct contact with because I never met my grandparents my mother's grandparents, my mother's parents. But the best way to explain, I think, is to tell the story of my mum and dad. So my mum was born to Frederick Brooke from Dublin and Bridget Fitzgerald from Limerick. Bridget Fitzgerald was a cleaning lady in Limerick, moved to Dublin, and is it the Shelbourne Hotel in St Stephen's Green? I think she was live-in there during the 1920s. Then, late 1920s, she moved to London for reasons that I don't really know, presumably economic. Meanwhile, Frederick Brooke had moved from Dublin to London, I think much earlier, when his father died, leaving the mother with 3 young boys and without really the means to support them. She had a sister in London, and so Frederick was packed off there. So Frederick and Bridget married. Frederick worked as a kind of occasional work, really, moving scenery in a theatre. He became a favourite of quite a well-known actress in the early 1930s called Evelyn Leigh, who, when my mother was born, gave him a £5 note, which was quite a lot of money in those days. And as a result of that, my mum was called Evelyn. And Evelyn grew up in a they were a poor family, a poor Irish immigrant family. And my mum, essentially journeyed away from that poor Irish background in multiple senses. She passed her 11 plus, which meant that she went to actually Notre Dame Grammar School in Elephant and Castle, which is a Catholic girls' grammar. So she'd already, to a certain extent, escaped a working class background at the age of 11, in a certain sense then, and she ended up, very unusually for a woman in the 1950s, going to university at the University of London, where she met my dad, whose grandparents were also from Ireland, from Dublin. They didn't meet in the dancing hall, they met in the Catholic library because they were both practicing Catholics. But my mum, I think, had an uneasy relationship with her background, and none of these facts, nothing that I've recounted, was remotely known until decades and decades later. And this was partly because of my mum's relationship with my father, who all we knew when I was growing up was that, booze was a kind of word that expressed all the contempt that my mum could kind of summon up for what it had done in the context of her family. And again, facts that emerged much later, it turned out that she and her mother had kept a separate post office account in which somehow they funneled money away so there would be a family holiday, because if they didn't keep that secret from the father, then they wouldn't have a holiday. She was sometimes kind of sent out to the pub by her mother in Kennington to fetch her father back and so on. And basically my mum moved class. My dad was from a middle-class family. She was a graduate. She became a teacher. My dad became a teacher and then a lecturer. The family moved to the north of England. I wasn't born at this time. My dad became a lecturer at a Catholic teacher training college. I was born in Bradford while he was at that college, but then moved to Knaresborough, a small town in North Yorkshire, and grew up in the context of a complete absence of reference to any Irish antecedents whatsoever. It was simply never thematised. There was just this kind of shadow of booze, and that was really it. I don't know whether it was conscious or, anyway, it wasn't quite chosen probably, but she'd moved into a different world. It was like year zero up in Yorkshire. And no discussion of Irish relatives, no discussion of the stories or nothing of that kind. Anyway, unfortunately for my mother, in some senses, Irishness erupted back into the family in an extremely indirect way when, through the person of George Best. Because in 1968, my brother, at the age of, he's 8 years older than me and was my kind of guide and mentor. he was watching the European Cup final and watched George Best score the goal that won the European Cup, essentially, for Manchester United. He started idolising George Best, started going to see Manchester United with a group of butchers, I think, from Knaresborough. I started following everything my brother did and started eventually going myself. George Best went the way he did and retired early, but my brother transferred his affections to another Irish player who was playing for Manchester United, another Northern Irishman, Sammy McIlroy, who some people might remember. By this time, I chose as my favourite player Jerry Daly. Well, he's still my favourite player of all time. People remember Jerry Daly? Yeah, good. And by this time, quite unintentionally, a narrative was developing in which we loved the Irish players in the team, and we loved them for particular reasons. They were both, Best, McIlroy, Daly, all very slight, physically fragile, full of skill and ingenuity, ready to kind of take on the massed organised ranks of teams like Leeds and Liverpool at the time, who didn't carry this kind of quicksilver aspect to them at all. And somehow we were spinning in our minds a romantic narrative of the Irish already at that point. Then, it sounds absurd, but it was influential, 1979 Cup final, I was 13 at the time, they played Arsenal. Arsenal at that time had an enormous Irish contingent of players, as some people may remember, Liam Brady, Sammy Nelson and others. And my brother and I watched the all-day Cup final coverage, but the cameras were inside the Arsenal coach as they went to Wembley Stadium, and playing, they'd put the Dubliners tape on, and we're all singing along to the Dubliners. And me and my brother thought this was kind of marvellous, and even sort of confused us in terms of attempting to generate the requisite hostility towards the opposition prior to the Cup final. And so a kind of affection was building that then became for me in particular, an interest in Irish literature. When I was 15 or 16, I read The Ginger Man and loved that. I became interested in Beckett, Yeats, and by the time I was kind of 18 or 19, I was something of a figure of fun with my peers at university, or my group of friends, because I, by this time, had begun to make public my declaration that I was a quarter Irish. Yeah. And this was significant to me. It was like a kind of aspect of gold in me that I was determined to burnish and put on display. And anyway, not surprisingly and understandably, I was mocked and ridiculed for attempting to do so. But started to go to Ireland frequently with those friends and others, and then I guess established a relationship. I was actually talking in trepidation to my brother last night, and we were talking through these kinds of things, and he made the frankly sort of disobliging point of would any of this have happened if it hadn't been for George Best? And that's a kind of good question. Because
it's a fascinating question, right? Because you rediscovered something that your mother, for very personal reasons, but also for reasons that were common to many millions of Irish immigrants who just associated the Ireland that they left with poverty and pain and didn't want anything more to do with it, and found their new lives that they constructed somewhere else liberating in a variety of ways. And that was especially maybe true for some women, given the type of family dynamics that you were talking about. And yet you have kind of rediscovered something that she suppressed through things that have nothing really to do with your background, more to do with a choice that you made of things that you thought were important about yourself, and then were able to connect to a part of your background.
Yes, partly that. I mean, which is it? Is it that one can choose an aesthetic, and there was lots about a romantic Irish aesthetic, which my brother was also saying we were probably using this as a counterpoint to, we were growing up in Yorkshire, where the Yorkshire mentality is rather different, rather dour, and call a spade, and if you don't tell it straight, then what the bloody hell are you doing? Whereas the Irish, all constructions that I love, such as the use of the conditional, now would you be after doing, or will you be? It's speculative. It's it's a different, it's a playful relationship to the real. You don't get that in Yorkshire.
And which actually are you definitely get it in Kerry, and those are very much like this kind of little bit of gold inside yourself that you were able to connect to this Irish culture that you were attracted to. Those phrases, I mean, are relics of a language that has changed, enormously in Ireland, and therefore are in some ways our own little bit of gold that's connecting with our past, because there is a certain element of identity that is about what parts you emphasize, and you were choosing at that particular time of your life to emphasize a particular part of your identity that you were able to connect to something. But that easily could be a story of someone who moved here from the other side of the world, I suppose, and loved the Dubliners or loved Joyce, there are many famous stories of people. Indeed, there are many people in Dingle who I can immediately think of who are like that, who identify in that way. So I think your trepidation of talking to us about this was misplaced, because I think it's an amazing story, an amazing journey, and a very reflective one. Gavin, I wonder if I could ask you actually in the context of Julian's story about your own connection to Ireland, because you, sort of like Deirdre and Patrick, have a background in a sort of iconic location of the Irish diaspora. So if you just tell us about how your connection to home is.
Let me start by expressing deep solidarity with the trepidation of my fellow panelists, because
they all had to be dragged out here.
I can talk about lots of things, but talking about my own sort of where I'm from and my own identity
this is group Irish
does
therapy.
Not fly off the tongue. So this is some therapy here. So it's a very different story to Julian's fascinating one. So I guess my family history would be that staunch Glaswegian Catholic kind of working class family background from both sides of from both parents. But before that, on one side it would have been my grandparents, and one side it would have been my great grandparents from both north and south of Ireland. So basically, all the heritage was Irish, but on different sides they moved at different times to Glasgow. So a lot of my relationship, to the extent, I guess, with Ireland would be mediated through my sort of deep family roots in Scotland, in Glasgow. It's the first thing to say. And it was just always part of who you were, that you had this Irish part of you. So it was there, it was it was very different to what Julian sort of said, but it was never kind of articulated in, now let's talk about your Irishness sort of thing. It was just like, you have
just a fact. Yeah.
You have two legs,
your name was Kelly,
you're part
Glasgow.
Irish and you're Catholic, and that's that. And you come from Glasgow. But much to the amusement of the rest of my family, I sound like a southern, middle class. They think it's hilarious that I sound like that, because everybody else basically sounds Glaswegian. So it was a very particular story, but it was also, as you said, lots and lots of people have followed that path from Ireland to Glasgow. But it kind of stayed with me, because we moved, like lots of people, they moved from Scotland. My dad got a job in England, so we moved down. I was only ever going to go to a Catholic school, so I went to a Catholic school outside London, big kind of comprehensive, where people from all sorts of other towns who were Catholics came, lots of Irish families, or kind of kids of Irish families. And at that time, there was a kind of parallel with what Julian was saying, in that there was a kind of reaction against another culture. So I suppose in my school, the dominant, there was a kind of choosing Irish when I was at school meant, did you want to be part of the skinhead culture? Because that was a really big deal in the 70s and 80s, like a mainstream, not a fringe thing. It was like that was probably the dominant youth culture in my school. And that wasn't the Irish culture until there was another thing which was not that, and they didn't really like these two sides didn't go on. I didn't really want to be part of the skinhead culture, so that definitely was a positive choice. And the other lot seemed to have a lot. They were kind of much more playful. There was much more fun, and there was much more going out to bars and stuff at a young age, and music and so on, which kind of spoke to me. So there was that kind of choice. But I think for me, the thing, I've got this sort of, as you grow up, you never think, am I going to, I hadn't thought about this. This is part, as I say, it's part of who you are. But as you grow up, as with lots of people, I guess you have kids at the same time as your parents pass away. So you're kind of left, the bit of you that were just sort of made sense of all this is no longer there. And suddenly you're in this position where you've got kids and they grow up a bit and they're asking different questions of who am I and where am I from. And suddenly you find yourself in this position of having to choose what stories you tell them. And particularly because in my family, the other half, better half of my family comes from a very different place. It's a kind of North London Jewish family. And I tell you, I used to think, I was raised with this implicit assumption that there's nothing as tight in terms of identity. There's nothing in tight on these Isles as a kind of Irish descent Catholic family. That's the most highly formed, the sort of family group you get. You know who you are and where you're from. Well, little did my parents know, is all I can say. Because when you actually move into a kind of North London Jewish family, they really know who they are and where they're from. And that's the trump card, you know what I mean? It's like, which is a wonderful thing, and I'm not disparaging at all, but it's there, you know. And so you have to sort of choose. It would be very easy just to sort of say, well, that's who my kids are, 100%, and because that's what's around them. I don't have the extended family in London, it's all in Scotland. And so I guess you have to make a choice. Like, would you feel okay if you just let it all go? Which is not something I'd ever thought about before I had children at all. And I guess I realised that I wouldn't feel okay, which kind of is, in a way, it sounds, but it was a bit of a surprise to me. But I really wouldn't feel okay. So I'm trying to work out, and I haven't got the answers to this. I'm trying to navigate this thing of telling them who they're from, telling them that there is an Irish and indeed obviously a Scottish part of them, which is really important, whilst avoiding the pitfall, which for me is really deeply felt, and I think I can feel that, Julian, you might share this too, of kind of overclaim, because I'm kind of allergic to the idea that I'm pretending that I'm something I'm not. And I guess it's, you know, like I've always said, like lots of people, you have this imposter syndrome sort of going on at the back of your head, and I've always had it in my life. Like you go and work in Downing Street, and you have this voice saying, "Who the hell do you think you are?" You know. In fact, the day I got a job in Downing Street, I told my dad, who was still around, and I said, "I've got that." And like that, he said, quick as a flash, "Don't forget you're Irish," which is not something he said. That wasn't like a normal. And it came to me last night. He said, "Don't forget your Irish." And I'm kind of, what does that, you know, like, what was going on? But that is what, like that, he said that. And I was like, okay, Dad. But I had this, I have a kind of another version of imposter syndrome, which is when I was thinking about this talk, which is this kind of Irish voice saying, "Who the hell do you think you are to be claiming?" But then I hear my mum's voice, which is like listing my Irish heritage. And so, you know, of course you can choose that. You know, that's who you are, get over it. So I was trying to find a way of doing that and talking to kids without creating a story about your Irishness, which is entirely antiquated and mythical and so on, which I have no interest in. That's made easier by the fact they're sports fanatics. So at the moment, it's kind of, we can do a lot of, and Ireland are very good at the moment at rugby and stuff, so there's that. But there's a kind of, but there's other, you know, it's thinking about how you talk about the reality of Ireland today a little bit, and they're only quite young, so I don't want to overstate this, but it's made, to link back to the last talk, and I'll shut up in a minute, but made easier by Brexit in a really perverse way, because my 7-year-old is deeply exercised about it, at a London school, like just about every London school, full of dozens of nationalities, many people from all over Europe, but also the rest of the world, many of his friends are from other countries and so on, and just this whole idea of Brexit is just like, it's just like, what is that about, Dad? I mean, that's just crazy. And then we've talked, which was a good way into talking to the fact, he was like, well, is Ireland going to leave? But Ireland's part of this gang as well. I'm like, oh God, they're not going anywhere. They're so in it. And he's like, well, that's these Irish people, they're onto something, aren't they? You know? And he was kind of interested in the fact that they would never think of, I was like, they would never, that's just not going to happen. So it's
really interesting to me that you mentioned that, because I've lived in the UK for 10 years, and obviously there is now, you know, there are tens of thousands, well over 100,000 now, and it will be into the hundreds of thousands of British people who have gone rummaging in the attic to find Granny's birth certificate because there is an EU passport that they're entitled to that is suddenly extremely valuable. And I really wonder, you know, you guys have these very reflective attitudes towards your Irish identity, which are fascinating and very much in contrast to many other stories. But like, will the process of doing that for many British people make them ask the same kind of questions that you guys are asking? And will we see British people whose parents or grandparents or whatever came from Ireland asking these questions? I mean, I wrote a piece in the paper about the passport issue a couple of years ago, and it was very positive, like, yes, we should be willing to give people passports because they're part of our broader sense of identity. And the sub-editors in the Irish Times headlined it, "Do we really want to give passports to all these Brits?" ? Which does not imply that my answer was yes. But it's interesting that British-Irish dynamic is totally shifted by this choice that Britain is making, and suddenly makes Ireland seem the positive, future-looking forward thing that many people might choose as their identity.
Although it can be a choice, and often is for a lot of people. I think that's a choice. I mean, it's a political point and a political decision that's being made within a British context to opt for Irish identity because you're rejecting the version of Britishness, or more specifically probably Englishness that is emerging. So, arguably it's still very much tied up with an English context.
Actually, I want to ask Killian about this because Killian, Gavin said a few minutes ago the question of like, who are you and where do you come from? It's a question that I found basically impossible to answer about you because you've lived on multiple continents. And have a very strong link to Ireland as well. So if you could maybe tell us first a little bit about your connection to Ireland, and then I'm going to ask you a question about that sense of identity.
Yeah, sure. Well, my parents left Cork before I was born. I was born in Manchester and moved to Nebraska, which, as I'm sure you know, is in the Great Plains of the U.S. at the top of the tourist itinerary. In 1986, so I was only 2 years old. So as you can tell by my accent, that's where I was raised. But in the late 90s, my family initiated a kind of halting and complicated process of moving back to Ireland. I have 3 sisters, and we're all pretty close in age. We were kind of all teenagers then. And in addition to bringing lots of joy, that move was disruptive for us, and so actually, in my teens, Ireland became this thing that I didn't like, basically, because it felt like this sort of this thing that had interfered with, I guess, the course of our adolescence. So I think unconsciously I made a decision not to spend a lot of time here for a series of years, and then it wasn't until kind of like my mid-20s that I cultivated my own relationship to Ireland, and it's one that's become really important to me, and I love this place. I particularly love West Cork, but Kerry's cool too.
Very good.
No, but I mean, I think for me, for a lot of different reasons that I think I probably don't fully understand, that's the way it had to happen. Like, I had to figure out what it would mean to develop a kind of loving relationship with this place. And that doesn't mean that I ever became at home here, right? I mean, I think that, it's possible to be Irish and be a stranger in Ireland, which I think is something that's implicit in a lot of what we talked about. And I think that's okay, right? I mean, I think being a stranger in a place that also feels like a kind of home is a totally, it's a strange and in some ways unsettling position, but it's a legitimate position, right?
That's what I wanted to ask you about what Julian was just saying about people, in Britain rejecting a certain type of British identity to take on their Irish identity. You've recently moved to Sydney on the other side of the world. So you have had experience living in lots of different parts of the Irish diaspora, of being a stranger in lots of different places.
That's right.
Like, how have you found, because obviously Australia is about as far away from West Cork as you can get. How have you found that? How does that affect your identity, being a stranger in all of these different places, and now in such a totally changed environment to where you grew up, in the heartland of America?
Yeah, well, I think that my relationship to my own identity is never not in process and always unsettled, right? And that's probably just not going to change. And again, I think that's probably okay. Australia is interesting. I've only been in Australia for about 18 months. I've got a cousin in Australia, and I've got friends in Australia who I made, friendships that I made in Ireland. And one of the things that I found fascinating about Sydney is the way in which some Irish people who, and I'm particularly thinking of kind of my peers, who moved to Australia with the kind of foreknowledge, or at least the expectation, that they will not spend more than, say, 2 or 3 years in Australia. This is a way of thinking about being in a place that's felt unfamiliar to me, but is defining, I think, for some communities, Irish communities within Sydney. And I don't really participate in those communities. I mean, I sort of interact with them through relations, as I mentioned, and friends. But I guess I'm interested, kind of coming back to the video, right, is that what if Irishness, instead of meaning finding other people from Kerry or West Cork or whatever and hanging out with them, what if Irishness actually means a kind of cosmopolitanism, right? And so what if expressing Irishness is actually about not doing the thing, the sort of cliquey thing, but instead trying in some limited way, right, to whatever the word is, integrate, assimilate, explore locality in a more cosmopolitan way.
Well, there's something really interesting about what Gavin was saying about your children and about their dual identities coming from you and Ella of Irishness and Jewishness. And it's obviously something that is a big issue in New York as well. Two great communities, and Philip was talking earlier about the influence that has had on the development of Irish music and Irish culture and so on. But it's also something that's interesting of Jewishness, you know, the word diaspora that we now use, you know, we took from the way that Jewish people think about their global community. And it seems to me, talking to these 5 different stories, that Irishness is a global community with like all sorts of shades in it that evade any kind of simplistic stereotypes of the leprechaun on the front of Notre Dame, but that's still a very important part of it. That is one of the, Johnny Cash's 40 Shades of Green. Like, there is something about the fact that we are far-flung and that creates all of these different stories that you then relate back to. I mean, one thing I'd be really interested to hear before we finish from the 5 of you is, like, how do you see the future of your identity? Because it feels like everybody is on you were saying, Killian, that like your identity is always in process. I suppose that's true for all of us all the time, right? Yeah. Like different ages, where we live, what job we do, and so on, affects all of these things. And we are all, in some ways, strangers in different ways, whether in Ireland or not. Like, how do you see, if we were all to meet up and have a drink in 20 years' time, what kind of relationship with Ireland do you guys expect or hope to have? Like, is it something that you think will just continue to inevitably be part of your life because it's something that is innate to you, or do you think that it's something that you might go away from? Or maybe, Julian, do you think it's something that you might further embrace, and that the imposter syndrome that Gavin talks about will go away and that you'll feel like a real Irish?
No, that'll never go away.
Yeah.
I would sort of 2 contradictory responses to that, really. Firstly, I mean, I know that I'm now in a kind of pattern of coming here and will continue to do so for the rest of my life. And like I thought Killian put it very well, the idea of simultaneously being not from here, because I did not grow up in Ireland, but feeling a relationship which has an affinity. It isn't home because I didn't grow up here, but it's in that family of concepts, my felt relationship with Ireland. But the contradictory part of the response is that right now, again, to use Killian's identity, constantly in flux. Somehow, well, I still feel and will claim till my dying day to my friends that I'm quarter Irish, and that's significant. But I'm more preoccupied by the English 3/4, and these things are instinctive the way they come to you. And so on the Irish passport question, so my niece is applying for an Irish passport. She's got a Northern Irish grandmother on my brother-in-law's side. I obviously could, but I'm not going to, I don't think, because I kind of feel bound up with the fate of England right now. And what we were talking about earlier, the Irish identity, the crucial and inspiring aspect to it, which comes from the fact of being a small nation from which people have always gone away, although increasingly they come back as well, and increasingly people come here for the first time, as we saw in the video. But it has that particular history of a small nation with a history of emigration. Identity was always celebrated here, whether you were here or elsewhere. But it was never part of a narrative of domination. It was part of a narrative of liberation, but never of domination. England obviously is a very different place. Britain is different. And there are extremely complicated interweavings of identity and domination in history. And now this, part of the explanation of Brexit is a kind of transgressive notion of Englishness being asserted against some perceived stripping away of something from English identity, from what England was. And that can go in very kind of dark directions. It can go in directions which I think, as Gavin was saying earlier, need to be understood and thought about in terms of these immensely proud towns in the northwest of England, which saw, well, now their source of pride, although obviously it's not, is an Amazon warehouse, whereas once it used to be a trade that dominated the town. All that, as Gavin said earlier, was not thought through, or it was neglected, that side of place and emotion. And the post-industrial experience was an experience in place, and it was an emotional experience, and I don't think anyone kind of thought about it like that in policy terms for 30 years. But it's complicated if it re-emerges in a narrative of nationhood against, the dictatorship of Brussels, because that reawakes old demons in Englishness and sends us down the wrong track. So anyway, right now it's necessary, in my mind, to focus on the English bit, but to try and develop, again, was it Esme earlier was saying, this kind of social democratic conception which can speak to some of these themes and take this transgressive notion of Englishness which emerged and found its outlet through Brexit, although it was about a lot more than Brussels, I think, find some way of diverting that to a kind of better political end.
I mean, there's something really interesting in all of our stories about the way that we have to, as individuals, but also as members of communities, accommodate different identities within ourselves, and that those obviously, at times, as we've seen in all of your stories, are to do with individual personal choices. Patrick, you chose where to go to university and you choose to come back here. Julian, you identified with a particular Irish culture that you found attractive. Gavin, you started asking these questions because of your children. Deirdre, you come back to this place all the time and you have relatives here who you're connected to. And Killian, you've gone through this long period of moving away from Ireland and then coming back. But at the same time, those individual choices of what is important to us and what is how we accommodate those things as individuals are also massively affected by the world we find ourselves in. Deirdre and Patrick are living in America that's going through huge flux. You have a part of both of your identities, and at one stage, still part of both of your work in media and politics that have to do with a tumultuous thing that's going on there. And Killian, because you've been all over the world, you're seeing the different types of upheavals that can take place in the many places that Irish people live. And I think that if something comes out of this about the idea of place, it's that the place that we are and the place that we come from hugely affect the way that we think about ourselves. But so too do the individual choices that we make. And Irishness is absolutely not one thing. It can be an infinite number of different things, but it's also what we individually make it of ourselves. And that's what hopefully people will take away from these conversations. So thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you all for listening. I think it was